Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Behaviours and values are changing at a rapid pace. I'm here today to tell you how. You may have been fearing for your lives and your jobs and possibly your pensions after yesterday's talk by Daniel Susskind about the rise of the machines. I'm here today to tell you that the real disruption is not coming from technology. It's actually how technology is disrupting people's values, behaviours, and that's where the real disruption is. It's coming from people and they're changing expectations. The rise of multi-generational households is going to have a huge impact on how people spend money and save money and engage with banks. And then secondly, multi-generational workplaces are going to have a huge impact on how the workplace changes. So with those four trends in mind, what do you guys need to be thinking about? So the first thing is, we have witnessed over the last 10 years the dominance of millennial culture, right? As I said earlier on, baby boomers upload the most to Facebook, now spend the most money on technology. They actually spend the most money on travel of any generation. They spend the longest time in the gym of any generation. Baby boomers are starting to act like they're millennial children. My mum's just taken up yoga. I'm a living embodiment of this example. So in many senses, we've seen also that millennialisation happen in corporations. Flexible working that millennials demanded not so long ago has become the norm. A move to a much more democratic internal comms that millennials are much more akin to has become the norm. In many ways, we are all millennials now. We all eat avocado on a Sunday brunch. We all send WhatsApp text messages. We all engage with the world with a millennial mindset. The big transition for your industry in the next 10 to 15 years will be the massive transference of wealth and assets from baby boomers, who have it all and are hoarding it, to their millennial children. Millennials and Generation Z are going to have a very different life to their baby boomer and Xer parents and family. Basically, millennials are going through a process of arrested development. They're delaying adulthood, okay, by actually 10 years. And that has huge implications for how they save, how they view education, how they get on with their parents, dare I say it, and how they're thinking about making those big decisions in life. So they're, first of all, delaying adulthood. But secondly, they're going to live a very long time. 50% of millennials will live until their mid-90s, which means, unfortunately, you're going to have to work until you're 80. And bad news. But, don't worry, all the hard work will be done by robots. You'll just be emotionally connecting to people. So if you're all living to 95, or at least half of you, take up smoking immediately. If you're all living to 95, the pressure of having to work till 80 will obviously be there. I doubt they'll legislate for that, but it will certainly be there. It's unrealistic, at the very least, to say you're going to stop working at 65. Much more likely is you will have a working life of 60 years. And you will, because you've started adulthood 10 years later, hopefully you won't feel the longevity, the full longevity of that. In many ways, age and your longer life expectancy is your greatest asset. Because as I said, a third of millennials don't have savings. They have, okay, we're getting better at the whole pensions thing, but a number of us still have student debt, and a number of us cannot afford to buy a house. So in terms of our life stages, we're lagging behind the baby boomers at our age. What we will have is something called a multi-stage journey. There will be periods in your life where you go back into training. That may be something that is sponsored by you, or sponsored by your employer, or sponsored by your parents' inheritance, who knows. But the point is, you're going to have periods where you're going to have to retrain. You're going to have periods where you're potentially going to have to volunteer. potentially when you're self-employed, and potentially periods where you are in classic employment. And then obviously periods where you are potentially raising a family. But you're going to have a much more multi-stage life, work life, than a classic linear three-stage life. It's a very different lifespan, and that has incredible implications for politics, obviously, policy, but also financial services, right? How can you help, as a bank, millennials live this multi-stage journey, which has to be bespoke and individual because, people are going to have very different individual lives. So how can banks, and you as a bank, help millennials plan this multi-stage journey? And how, as a bank, can you help your millennial employees plan for this multi-stage journey? Millennials are very savvy. Instinctively, they know that training is really, really important. Yes, they're the best educated generation in history. 50% of millennials have a first degree. 32% of them have a second degree. They go into a job, there's like training for a couple of years, and then it just tailors off. And they're banging at their boss's door saying, give us training, help us learn, help us learn. Millennials are great learners, and they're right to be, because they're going to have to do it and adapt throughout their working lives. They cannot imagine or remember a time when the economy wasn't associated with austerity and recession. If millennials are optimists, Generation Z are realists, much more realistic and grounded. If millennials are tech savvy, Generation Z have a much more, dare I say it, skeptical view of technology, and particularly data. They're the generation that are not on Facebook. They're the generation that likes Snapchat. And the reason they like Snapchat is because it disappears. They're the generation that prize their data and privacy above any other generation. I was talking to an 18-year-old kid who, very sophisticated and mature young man, who said to me, I never post any photos of me on social media unless I'm in a suit. And I was like, why? It's a bit odd. He said, no, I know that when it comes to applying for a job, my digital footprint is my CV. And I've got to be so careful about what I upload there. If millennials were on Facebook and Twitter, this is the generation that is on Instagram, that is on Snapchat. In fact, the average Generation Zer has at least 150 followers on Instagram. This is the generation that has a private Instagram account for their unique and filtered circle, and a public Instagram account. If millennials were commentators, tapping away their learned thoughts on the world, this is the generation of broadcasters. For this generation, the internet is primarily, if not actually probably only, a visual medium. They think, they learn, they see, they communicate in visuals. And as we know, if those baby boomers that upload 25 photos, gorgeous photos of their lovely grandchildren onto Facebook, Generation Z will take 100 photos and upload one. Perfectly airbrushed, perfectly set, the lighting in the right way. They all see themselves as influencers. This is an incredibly entrepreneurial generation that price compare in the shop. Price comparison online is second nature to them. They wouldn't buy anything without doing an online price comparison. This is the generation in which 47% think themselves an expert in something, which is kind of extraordinary when they're under 21. But what are they experts in? Well, they've had the world's information in their pocket. So a comment made earlier on about the insufficiencies of the British education system to prepare this generation and the next for the age of automation. Well, do you know what? They're not getting all their information from school. They're getting it from YouTube. Now, it's a misunderstanding and a misemphasis to say the education system has to be changed. It's about equipping this generation with the agility and the resources and the mindset in order to be prepared for the next generation of the world of work. This is a generation that actually understands the importance of getting away from their phone. What's really interesting about Generation Z, they've started buying books. So, like millennials discovered vinyl about 5 to 10 years ago, rediscovered vinyl, Generation Z have discovered books. I was interviewing an 18-year-old girl called Zoe from Penzance, and she said to me, it's great. I just, I can turn off my phone, put it in another room, get into my bed and just, pick up this book, and it's a real thing, and it's like tangible, and it smells like a book, and I can just lose my mind and it kind of, total imagination in this book. I said, well, how do you buy these books? And she said, well, I was buying them through Amazon. And I said, oh, yeah. She said, but it takes 24 hours to arrive? Like, that was a massive inconvenience. She said, but then I discovered the library. She said, it's great, they're just there, waiting for you. And I was like, right, we've really come full circle here. The point is that actually this is the generation that is discovering actually offline experience. This is the generation, when asked what was their favourite form of communication, whether it be from teachers, lecturers or bosses, was face-to-face communication. Now perhaps you might say that every generation would say that, but this is a generation that sees it as a novelty. And that's the point. And by the way, they're not very good at it. They will look at the floor. How do you recruit this generation? And how do you speak to this generation? The point, I think, is really important to understand is that Generation Z see themselves as the brand. They've been curating, collating, and customizing their online brand since they were 13. Every picture, every comment, every post is completely fitting with that brand. They are their own spin doctors. So whereas marketeers would traditionally say it's all about B2C, brand to consumer, business to consumer, I should say. Actually, with this generation, it's about B to B. It's business to brand. Business to business, because they are the brand. And they will buy products, they will endorse products, they will use services, and they will shout and scream and praise products that actually reinforce their brand. And that's where I think the secret lies to communicating with this generation. So how do you communicate with them? Firstly, it has to be in video. Secondly, it has to be instant. Thirdly, it has to be democratic. This is a generation that can tweet the President of the United States if they want to, and you may get a reply. Thirdly, there's some really interesting things going on in gamification and the way in which you can use gamification to turn things into a game. That's what gamification is. To communicate with this generation. And don't think that's a boys thing. More girls purchase games in this country than men. The big thing in the next 20 years will be generational diversity. And how, for business, that is the secret of success. There's been an overemphasis, I believe, on the millennial demographic, sometimes to the detriment and frustration of the older employees within the company and the older consumers within the company. There are plenty of people that turn up to a bank and go, I don't want to use a machine. I've been using this bank for 60 years. I want to talk to a cashier. My mum is one of those people. We are going to get more multi-generational workforces and more multi-generational consumers as people are living longer, but also more multi-generational decisions being made because of those households dominated by 3 generations or more. So what does this mean? The first thing is you guys need to look after your older workers and older clients more than you have been. You need to be giving them some love. Especially in the workforce in terms of training. Training for older workers is absolutely abysmal in the UK. It's pretty bad in the US. There's an assumption that you just kind of fade out. What happens, and how brilliant, if you had a workforce where actually the people being trained in robotics were those in their 60s? What if you had those role models of people really at the forefront of technology, still working at 70? The second thing that needs to happen is that the millennial generation that are now moving into leadership positions have to learn and be trained into how to lead and manage multi-generational teams and multi-generational clients. and dare I say it, multi-generational consumers. And multi-generational clients where actually there are several stakeholders who all have charge of the purse. Multi-generational teams and workforces where the skills of all employees have to be appreciated and really brought out to the fore. So millennials, who are now moving towards in the next 2 years getting the largest demographic in the workforce, have to be able to manage those multi-generational teams and clients. The third thing is that ageism, a bit like sexism and racism, has to be addressed within a company. And that's not just in terms of actual hostility, personal hostility, but in where you put your emphasis. We again, in the morning's comments, I heard a lot about innovation, technology, a bit about empathy, but actually, if we are moving towards an ageing society, yes, there has to be a focus on what's coming around the corner, but also a commitment to what's already being provided. Generational diversity will be as important as gender diversity and racial diversity within a company for it to be a success.